It is fair to say that up to now, the Russians have carried out sabotage operations in the West, including in Poland, but they've done so with proxies. Because frankly, it's quite easy and depressingly cheap to be able to hire some local thugs to burn something down, as we discovered with the attacks on the warehouses in northeast London. Those were not highly trained Russian special forces that were going in. Those are just local thugs who saw an opportunity to earn some money that they thought would be a fairly easy thing. So I think the idea that the Russians would actually be sending special forces across the very, very heavily fortified and monitored Polish border does sound a little bit iffy to me, but, ultimately, who knows?
It's really interesting, the kind of rhetoric that's being talked about on Poland after the drone incursions now, 3 weeks on. It's alleged that the Kremlin is preparing a sabotage operation there. President Zelensky is talking about that very openly. What are the signs of that?
Yeah, to be brutally honest, none whatsoever. I think this is all part of the fact that we have to realise that there is actually a three-cornered sort of political campaign here. There is the West, there is Moscow, and there is Kyiv, which has its own interests and clearly wants to keep Europe engaged and, to put it very bluntly, worried. So, yes, we've had these claims from Kyiv that the Russians are planning to send basically special forces or intelligence officers into Poland to carry out sabotage operations. Whereas what Moscow is claiming is that the Ukrainians and the Poles together are planning to stage a kind of a mock attack using Russians who have defected and joined the Ukrainian forces. And they're going to use that as a pretext as to therefore why NATO should be stiffening its position. Now, what is the reality? Obviously, I don't know. However, it is fair to say that up to now, the Russians have carried out sabotage operations in the West, including in Poland, but they've done so with proxies. Because frankly, it's quite easy and depressingly cheap to be able to hire some local thugs to burn something down, as we discovered with the attacks on the warehouses in northeast London. Those were not highly trained Russian special forces that were going in. Those are just local thugs who saw an opportunity to earn some money that they thought would be a fairly easy thing. So I think the idea that the Russians would actually be sending special forces across the very, very heavily fortified and monitored Polish border does sound a little bit iffy to me, but, ultimately, who knows?
It's interesting that you talk about these three-pronged different interests in talking about what may or may not be happening. I just, on the subject of Moldova, though, in the presidential elections, there was a huge amount of publicity and statements made about Russian interference ahead of those, or alleged Russian interference ahead of those elections. And it did go more towards the EU way and not towards the Kremlin and towards Russia. Do you think that actually, as you were saying, that being more aware and being more prepared to call things out before they happen actually had an effect there and actually stalled whatever the Kremlin may or may not have been plotting?
I mean, look, I can, because I don't really count and matter, I can actually be a little bit more bullish. I'm sure that Moscow was indeed trying to meddle in the Moldovan election. And yes, I think the fact that it was called out was in many ways a positive thing. I mean, we also have to register that there were some slightly worrying signs also from Moldova, in the sense that, we had two parties that were essentially disqualified just a couple of days before the election, to anti-government, pro-Moscow parties, with not enough time for them to appeal and so forth. And there were some other sort of slightly worrying signs about the degree to which some, I wouldn't say anti-democratic, but slightly questionable practices were used. But nonetheless, clearly it's because the Moldovan government regards itself in an existential position, in that, it is essentially under considerable pressure. There's talk that the Russians may have put $400 million into this campaign to try to destabilize Moldova. And Moldova is, after all, an incredibly poor and small country. Therefore, this was a serious threat. But precisely, in some ways, what we get is time and time again, Putin uses assets and strategies for, frankly, quite questionable purposes. I mean, Moldova, even if a pro-Russian government had come in power in Moldova, which was never really the likelihood, but even then, well, what would Putin do with that? It's not even as though actually his forces can reach Moldova without having to go through other countries' airspace. So, I think sort of for questionable purposes, Putin just gets carried away, or, is encouraged by people around him to get carried away by a particular task. throws resources into it that he then loses. I mean, that's $400 million that he's not going to see again. And also gives us a better sense as to what he can do so that we can begin to target-proof ourselves, harden ourselves against future attacks. And this is what I mean about Putin not being very smart in many ways. He has his talents, we have to acknowledge that, but I think geopolitically he's clearly quite limited. And time again, he fritters away assets that really needed to be used in a much more strategic way.
And how well do you think he's dealing with the problems back home in terms of the fuel shortages that are being caused by Ukraine's ability to now sustain and repeat long-range attacks on Russian oil refineries?
I think it's fair to say that throughout his career, it seems, Putin has had something of the luck of the devil. And at the moment, his real luck is precisely that he has a lot of very, very sharp technocratic managers of his system, in the government, in the central bank and elsewhere. Now, this particular problem with the very effective long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russian petrol refineries and distribution venues and so forth, of which there are just too many, too widely spread for the Russians to be able to protect, is causing a real problem, because it's a problem that actually affects ordinary Russians. And there's nothing really much that the state can do to featherbed them. It's tried claiming that the real problem is just seasonal maintenance and so forth. No one really buys that. How well is Putin coping with that? Well, look, ultimately he is the autocrat of an authoritarian regime. I mean, this is not a democracy in any way. He can ride out a lot of pressure up to the point when you actually get people on the streets, and we're nowhere near that. But it does emphasize to me why actually Putin's gamble that he can outlast Ukraine is perhaps understandable when you look at the size of the respective economies and populations and so forth, but increasingly carries with it risks. Risks that, a gathering together of a variety of different issues. We already, inflation is unlikely to go below about 7%, despite the fact that the target is 4%. Although pensions and minimum wage are being increased, a lot of people's salaries are now beginning to be squeezed after a couple of years in which they did quite well. Now there's trouble with petrol, and that just doesn't affect just filling up your family car. That also affects the trucking industry and so forth. It increases prices for things like food and also creates sort of shortages. So, bit by bit, all these things come together. And although I think until relatively recently, Putin was trying to sort of hand wave that away, increasingly now, he is clearly looking at economic issues. I don't think he truly understands the nature of the issue, perhaps because people don't really want to tell him how bad things could get. But nonetheless, there is that growing sense that the clock, it may be ticking for Ukraine, but it's also ticking for Russia.
So that gamble that he can outlast Ukraine, it may well prove to be wrong.
It may well. Again, so much depends on how far the Ukrainians can continue to find manpower, because that is their sort of crucial issue, and also whether or not they can fund their state, which is why we're having so much interest in this issue of trying to seize Russian sovereign assets that are currently frozen in the West, because at the moment, there are real questions about the long-term liquidity of the Ukrainian government. But against that, the Russian situation is more unpredictable, and we have to acknowledge that Russia does not look as if it's heading for a sort of imminent collapse or anything like that. But nonetheless, the easy assumptions that maybe were dominant this spring, in which in some ways Putin batted away the option of trying to work with Trump to reach some kind of a deal. And essentially he did string Trump along. Well, I do wonder if he's now regretting that, because, as winter is coming, things are looking a little bit tougher for Russia.
So do you think he's going to be tempted? He's not going to come to the negotiating table, though, is he?
I think that he's willing to accept the thought that there may be some kind of deal that suits him, but that's only if Ukraine is really willing to basically, throw a lot at him in order to sort of try and get him to end the war. He probably still is going to demand that piece of the Donetsk region containing the fortress belt of cities, which I don't think is for a moment that Zelensky can or would surrender. So, I think he still has this fantasy that Ukraine is going to come and more or less capitulate. That's his idea of negotiating. So, he's willing to talk, but on his terms. But a meaningful negotiation in which he actually accepts Ukrainian sovereignty and even just simply freezes the front line as it is now, I don't think he's there yet.
Just on the long-range strikes, that there are reports by the Reuters news agency today that the US is saying they'll provide Ukraine with intelligence on long-range, or two officials have said they'll provide Ukraine with intelligence on long-range energy infrastructure targets inside Russia. They're asking NATO allies to do the same. And there's also still this question as to whether or not President Zelensky will be granted what he's asking for, these long-range Tomahawk missiles, or something similar that could go much deeper into Russia. How worried do you think the Kremlin is about that, especially when you hear the likes of the spokesperson Peskov saying that this would mean US troops being directly at war with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, this is the trouble. Unfortunately, on the one hand, we have to deal with Russian rhetoric that is precisely designed to be a deterrent, to try and talk up potential risks. And on the other hand, we're dealing with an American administration, as I said, that we really don't know where it's going to be tomorrow, let alone next week. So, yes, this issue of intelligence to support long-range targeting is important, though I think to a large extent the Americans are already providing it. The Tomahawk missiles, it's a trickier one because, frankly, they are a high-value asset. A lot of other people want to buy them. And also America itself is looking to replenish its stocks of Tomahawks. So I can't help but wonder if this is one of these things which is going to be promised, but maybe when you actually look at the fine print, they wouldn't appear until 2027 or something like that. But again, this is the point. With Trump, he could decide tomorrow that he's going to send some Tomahawk launchers and missiles to Ukraine. Or he could decide tomorrow that he doesn't want to get involved. The bottom line is his position at the moment is that although he's increasingly fulsome about Ukraine and its chances of taking back territory and so forth, he has basically walked away from this war. He's not willing to provide aid in any practical sense. He's willing to let the Europeans buy weapons from America to give to Ukraine. So in some ways, I think this is him saying, I wasn't able to get this quick and easy win that I thought, therefore I'm not going to play.
And is that why you think at the moment that Kyiv has an interest in portraying the conflict as larger and more dangerous to Europe? And also, on the other hand, Putin also has his own motivations for portraying the NATO as a threat to Russia.
Yes, I mean, look, from Kyiv's point of view, I'm putting words in their mouth here, but my suspicion is they don't really trust us in Europe. And that's not because they think that we're secretly in cahoots with Russia or China or anything like that. It's that they are aware of the degree to which Western societies are buffeted by all kinds of other pressures, and particularly our political leaders. They find themselves hostage to the opinion polls and the electoral cycle and such like. So there is that sense of that almost Zelensky's job is to keep Europe engaged, just as we're desperately trying to keep America engaged. The Ukrainians are desperately trying to keep us in Europe engaged, not least because what's going to come is going to be very expensive. If they're going to be buying weapons from America to arm Ukraine, if they're going to be providing new resources to keep the Ukrainian government financially afloat, that all comes at a cost. So this is a time in which actually I don't think there are any Western politicians who are saying, oh, I have a few spare billion euros, pounds, or whatever that I just don't know what to do with. I mean, there is that sense that at a time when there's money for healthcare, money for national defence, after all, we're also meant to be spending money on building up our own armed forces. The constant fear in Ukraine is that for all our warm words, we will essentially start trying to scale down our commitments. So that's why they have to keep us worried. And I'm not blaming them for it. I mean, it's a very necessary task. And that's why they actually have to present this as a war that in some ways they are fighting on our behalf. But just to go back to the Russia point, yeah, I mean, there is an interesting calibration here. The very time when Western politicians are talking much more openly about war, a war of sorts, a hybrid war, call it what you will, but a war nonetheless, which is a tricky word to use because essentially it is about an armed conflict between states, not drones buzzing airports. At the same time, you have the Russians trying desperately to calibrate, being threatening towards us, but not quite so threatening that they alienate their own population. Because part of the way that Putin has been able to keep the Russian population quiet about all of this, even though there is increasing signs of disquiet, is essentially by making it optional for them. The war is being fought by volunteers, generally from impoverished regions, offered life-altering sums of money to go and fight. If you are a well-off Muscovite, you probably don't know anyone who's fighting in the war. You probably don't even feel that there's a war going on. So the worry is that if ordinary Russians start to think, oh my gosh, this could spiral out of control, that would be politically dangerous. So Putin and his propagandists are playing this delicate game of trying to scare the West, but not scare their own population.
It's going to be very interesting to watch, and obviously horrific that it continues, the war. But Mark, it's always good to have your insight. Thank you very much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.